Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. Now, I will admit to you all, I am recording this at 7:20 in the morning of the day it was supposed to release, but here we are because I came back from Greece and the jet lag was enough. But anyway, mental health is fun. Sometimes anxiety attacks happen. So, first off, before I forget to tell you all, because I would, normally I would do a Q&A or a series of Q&A episodes for the anniversary of this show, and I absolutely still want to do that, but I forgot to ask for questions far enough ahead of time to actually do it for the week of the anniversary. I'm a functioning person, I promise. I'm working on it. It is getting better. And so I will be putting the call out right now and through social media as well to please get your questions in for this year's Q&A. I only do these twice a year around the anniversary here in July and then also around the new year. So if you have any burning questions for me about, I mean, honestly, anything, like I'll pick and choose what I answer. But I really love to dive a little deeper into questions that you all have about the gods or the mythology, the things that I wouldn't have thought about myself and usually get me really thinking and going with some really interesting stuff. So ask whatever. If you are curious about some weird chronology thing, let me know. Some thing that doesn't make sense really, when it comes to what gods are what or doing what or any of these like the sort of major patriarchal questions I've been thinking of lately, what I've talked about in terms of the goddesses who came before and this kind of remnants of a matriarchal society. I mean, if you want to ask me about writing or podcasting or literally anything, have at it. The website is mythsbaby.com/questions, but there is also a link in this episode's description. Get them in within the next week or two, and I will do a big Q&A week of episodes sometime in August. Here I am with you all today for a very special episode because guess what? It is the week of this show's anniversary. We are at 7 years, which honestly is like, I don't even know what to do with that. I've been doing this for 7 years. That's longer than I've done like most things in my life. And I'm so thrilled that it's still going. I'm so thrilled that so many of you still want to listen to me. And not only is it still, popular as a podcast, but when I was in Greece this past time, we officially held the first group trip to Greece for the podcast and its listeners. And oh my gods, it went so well. It went so well. I was so nervous because, generally I am nervous around crowds, strangers, so I put myself in this career. But I was so nervous and of course also had been going through a ton of stuff / still am. And so I was honestly terrified. I was terrified and it was so fun. It was so fucking good. So I want to talk a little bit about it because I really hope we're going to be able to do more of these trips in the future. And so what ended up happening, this was very spur of the moment last year. Essentially, I knew that if I didn't just bite the bullet and decide to do this, that I was never going to. So it was very rushed. It was very thrown together. We had an amazing travel agent, Antonia, who did so much work for it. But it was really sort of, we just decided to just see how it goes and then go from there. And honestly, I think that plan was great. So the first ever, the sort of test run tour was me, my wonderful assistant producer, Michaela, and it's supposed to be 10 listeners. Unfortunately, one had to cancel at the very last minute. So it was a really small group. And of course, everyone got along immediately because everyone listens to this podcast and it just makes you good people. I don't know why I wasn't ready for that, but I wasn't, and it was the most lovely surprise. We had such an incredible group, and we visited, let me list them off. Athens, obviously, the Parthenon, the Acropolis, and its museum. And we went to Delphi and visited the Oracle. And then the following day, we drove up to Eleusis of the Mysteries fame and visited that site, which is utterly incredible. And one that is it's not tricky to get to, but I swear it just gets forgotten in terms of visiting Greece now. And then from Eleusis, we drove over the Corinthian Canal, which is just generally so interesting, and also the Isthmus. And then down into the Argolid Peninsula, where we went to Epidavros and saw the theater there, which is a work of goddamn art. It's the best preserved theater in Greece, and they still put plays on it today. The acoustics are unbelievable. And from there, we went to this adorable little seaside town of Nafplio, which is just a lovely, beautiful place to stay. And then the next day, we went to Mycenae. And I will tell you all right now, it was incredible. This is not something I can promise on future tours, that's for sure. But we were able to speak with Dr. Kim Shelton, the guest that I had on to speak about the Mycenaeans for the Bronze Age series that we did in April. And she gave us a tour of the museum, a museum which she helped to create because she's been working at that site for 35 years. Even married a guy she met there whose father owns land nearby. Like, it's just... it was fucking lovely. And so Kim gave us this incredible tour, and Mycenae is just fucking believable. So there we are. I'm saying fuck a lot in this episode, and I'm not going to stop. From Mycenae, we drove back to Athens, had a lovely afternoon in Athens, and then the next day we went over to the island of Aegina, which is just only about an hour outside of Athens by ferry, and which has this incredible, very unique temple to a goddess called Aphaia, who we have almost no information about, and there is only this one temple on Aegina. It is very well preserved, utterly beautiful. The sights are incredible, and it was a quick trip, which means then the rest of the day we had to spend swimming in the Saronic Gulf. And we did, and spent the night there on Aegina, and before going back to Athens for just one more kind of half day, and then everyone flew out. It was so much fun. I believe it was 7 nights, all of those different sites. And again, I say all of this because my goal is to just do the exact same thing next year. Everyone agreed it went really well. The choice of locations was really good. We got to see so much without overloading it too much. I mean, it was very go, but it was really good. And finishing it off on the island where everyone just got to swim and relax for half a day was really, really ideal. The hotels were utterly beautiful. It was really great. And so I'm going to do the same thing next year. The only change is we're going to take 2 more people. So in the coming days, you will be seeing some announcements on my Instagram and here on the podcast itself, looking for more people who are interested in coming on this next trip with us. So the goal would be, once again, that it's happening sort of towards the middle end of June, because I think it's really important to stay out of July and August, because the heat in Greece, even without climate change, is really strong then. But honestly, with the current horror that our world is going through, I mean, I was there on June, I think it was like the 9th. It was early June, and it hit 42 degrees Celsius, which is well over 100 for you Americans. Like, it was a lot. So anyway, that's why we keep to June. But the goal for this trip would be the extra 2 people. I hope to make it slightly more affordable. I know that it's not, super attainable for people to do this kind of group trip. I don't blame you. It's a lot, of course, I'll be honest, it's a lot more affordable to go on your own and sort of book everything yourself and do less of this stuff. That said, the group trip really, really was so nice, even the podcast aside, but getting together with all of you listeners who are paying attention and who care about this stuff that we're looking at is truly so great. Everyone was so lovely and respectful, and everyone just cared. And again, I should have expected that because I am so fucking over the top that if you guys listen to me, then you really do care. But the aspect I almost forgot to mention, which was really, really the key, is that our guide was this incredible woman named Nenna, and she loved us because we cared, because she usually does tours for people who are just like vaguely interested in Greece, and well, they care, but we're like, oh my god, no, tell me this like crazy, ridiculous, like niche nerdy thing that like she was telling us everything because we were so receptive to even just the little things. And she was really happy to let me jump in, to let Michaela jump in with the history. We really worked together to just really get the most out of these ancient sites. It was utterly incredible. And I will be doing everything in my power to make sure that we have the same guide Nina next year, because she was like, oh my god, she was just so lovely. We all want her back. So that's a large part of it as well. Those are the perks you get for, paying more. But all of that said, one of the things that makes a trip like that more expensive is that we're bopping around to all these different locations, and because of that, all these different hotels and things, right? And so we will be doing that trip next year. But if there is enough interest, we are also looking at doing a shorter trip a little before. So it would be, there would be a few days in between for me to rest my introvert brain. So it would just be a little earlier in June, definitely before the other trip. And that's because this separate trip, I don't know what I'm calling it yet, is going to stay in Athens, and therefore stay in the same hotel and reduce the cost considerably. It might be a little shorter, it might not, or maybe it will just be slightly shorter. And we're going to look at all of those options. That part is just now in the works, but I want to mention it to you because I really am going to try to make a more affordable option. I really do want this to be affordable for you guys. You know me. Capitalism is a disease, so we're doing it as, in as little amounts as possible. Like, I don't intend or ever expect to make money on these trips, to be very clear. This is not me doing a money grab. My goal for the next one is to break even, because this last one cost me a lot. It probably will still cost me because I will make custom merch. We made custom merch. I'm going to be posting it soon. Oh my god, it's so beautiful. If you've been on my Instagram, you've probably seen little hints of it in the photos of the group trip. All of that is to say, oh my god, I'm rambling. So the fun thing about coming back from jet lag and another country and trying to work again is that ADHD goes wild. In any case, I'm working on these two different types of trips. I hope to have more information soon. If the trip that we'll be staying just in Athens, we'll be just seeing all of the sites in Athens, more museums in Athens. The one I hope we would do a day trip to Delphi if it can remain affordable, and then also an afternoon or morning trip to Sunyon, which is just to the south. It's the southernmost tip of Attica, and it is where there is the Temple of Poseidon that is just utterly stunning. It's right over the sea, just on this kind of cliff. It's incredible. So we'll still be seeing a lot, just without going to different sites in Greece itself. And so more to come on all of that, but honestly, really exciting stuff. I'm so thrilled that it went so well, that everyone had so much fun. And so I want to tell you right now, keep it in mind, there will be one, hopefully two options next year. And I really hope to make this a thing. And what a fucking cool thing to start at year 7 on the podcast. I think it's a great little push. Be like, this is not going anywhere, And I love that you all still love it. So stay tuned. And I'm sorry I've been talking for 13 minutes before getting into the actual episode. The plan for today's episode, because again, I'm coming back from this trip, I'm slightly losing my mind, and it is the anniversary, which also means on Friday it's my birthday, and so I'm going to do minimal work, but I want to do minimal work that's really fun today. So what we're going to do is listen back again to one of the early episodes of the podcast. I've done it now, with the Medusa section of that one episode on Ovid's Medusa, but also on the very first episode, the Theogony, we did that. And so today I was thinking, it's 7 years. It's been 7 years of this podcast. It's so wild. Like, what would be a fun one for me to revisit from the earliest days. And I'm honestly a little afraid to listen to this episode. I'm a little afraid, but I'm ready. We are listening to the third episode I ever did on this podcast. And the title was Zeus, King of the Gods and Creepy Old Man Who Tricks Women. And I stand by that title. It's wonderful. So we are going to listen back to that. I might split this into 2 episodes depending on the lengths, because again, Friday's my birthday, and so if I can do it all up front, I'm gonna be happy about that. If you just decided to listen to this podcast and this is your first one, don't listen to this one. Go listen to another one. This is post-holiday ADHD brain trying to figure her shit out. Let's get into it. This is episode 266, Remnants of a Matriarchy Hidden in the Crimes of Zeus, revisiting episode 3.
First up on our list is Metis and the birth of Athena, Zeus's favorite child. Metis was a titan, or titaness if you want to get gendered with your nouns, which I don't. Chronologically, it's unclear when this went down, given Zeus ultimately locks the titans up, but regardless, Metis is a titan. She's wise and she's cunning, and she's got some trickster qualities as well. Zeus, as king of the gods and giant slut, has sex with Metis, and apparently he immediately fears the consequences. As with most men, he does not seem to have considered the consequences beforehand because there was an offer of sex. So he has sex with Metis and he fears the consequences because it's foretold that she will bear him children, one of which will be more powerful than him. And he is, after all, the son of Kronos, who was the son of Uranos, and we all remember how that went down. So, of course, Zeus does what any rational person would do after they choose to have sex with someone and then regret it because they would have a child that overthrows them. He eats Metis. But alas, it is too late, and Metis is already pregnant because Zeus has rocket sperm, apparently. And this is Greek mythology, so eating her does little to stem the pregnancy from developing further. Instead, Metis immediately begins constructing a helmet and robe for her fetal daughter. This is all from within Zeus, mind you. That's right, Metis is alive and functioning within Zeus, because mythology. It's great. So, here she is, just hammering away at this helmet using some sort of internal forge, and poor Zeus is really suffering from all the noise. He's got a tough life, you know? So he develops an awful headache, the poor guy, and his solution is to have Hephaestus, the god of the standard, external forge, cleave at Zeus's head with an axe. As we all do to save ourselves from a migraine. In fact, I'm feeling one coming on now. I wonder where my hatchet is. So, Hephaestus cracks open Zeus's head and bam! Out pops Athena. She's born a fully grown adult. She's fully clothed in a helmet and the robe that her mother made for her, and she's armed with a shield and weapons, and she utters a deafening war cry as she springs from the crack in Zeus's head. Athena is badass from day one. The annoying thing about this story, though, is that the mythology at large takes this to mean that Zeus conceived Athena himself, which is obviously bullshit, because patriarchy. So there are so many references to Athena being basically a pseudo, virgin birth, Zeus is the new Virgin Mary, sure, but fuck that, because Metis was her mom, and it only makes sense, frankly, because Athena's the goddess of wisdom, and Metis was also all about wisdom, and the word Metis even means wisdom in ancient Greek. So fuck the idea that Zeus had her all on his own. We know it doesn't work that way.
All right. Well, we are beginning with looking at Metis. I honestly had forgotten which goddesses I looked at in this episode of essentially it's the goddesses that Zeus has ruined. I didn't include the introduction, but I imagine that's what I went into. I mean, the word ruined is hard, but in the case of Metis, it's right. But essentially, this episode that I did, I remember it was going to be the second episode. And then I was like, I think maybe this is like a little too much shitting on dudes to like jump into this early, and so I made it, this is the third episode, but I really am so interested with how I went about it back then, in comparison to now. And so like I want to talk about Metis because Metis is such an interesting figure, and I clearly was like sort of scratching at the surface of it 7 years ago, but now that I'm this deep and have all my fucking theories about what came before, Metis is such an incredible example of the way mythology is used to explain things. We think about that in terms of how myths come to explain like the natural world and things like that. That feels really obvious, but it's also true of just how mythology doesn't necessarily explain like physical things in the world, but more so mythology explains how something came to be. And in the case of Metis, it is really tied to the hegemony of Zeus and the male gods. Because Metis being, the mother of Athena, who is consumed by Zeus and therefore becomes part of him so that he can like quote unquote virgin birth Athena, is so inherently tied to the way the patriarchy took over, and that is viewed through the gods, right? You can, if you think about it in that way of like there were all of these people that came before and they worshipped different things and they had different priorities, and then the mythology that survives for us today is trying to explain how things changed and what they became. When you think about it that way, you can really see this in Zeus's story with Metis. Metis is this primordial, well, I guess it's not primordial, but she's a Titan goddess. So she's like a very, she's old. She's an ancient goddess. She's a pre-Olympian goddess of wisdom who Zeus, I don't think this one should be read as assault. So he just, he was just being Zeus, and they had sex. And as soon as she gets pregnant, it's like, oh, well, that's not going to work, so he ingests her. And of course, like as a literal story, it's just this weird thing about like a god eating a woman and then giving birth to her baby through his head. You're like, okay, it just kind of, when you first look at this, it's like a real surface level idea of just like, oh, mythology is weird. Look at this weird story. But when you really think about it, what's happening is that a god, a male, is consuming an older, wiser mother goddess. He is consuming her and taking over her role as, a leader, as a wise, older woman, her role as a mother. He is taking that from her. And this particular example serves as this sort of the first time that Zeus really, really explicitly takes over this role that women, people with uteruses, have so explicitly, right? And because the patriarchy is inherently threatened by the power of the uterus, right? It is like the one thing they can't control. I say that with a laugh because fuck do they try. But it's the one thing they can't control physically in that way, right? Like women conceive and men contribute, but they would always have this fear in the back of their heads, like, is the baby mine? What did the woman do in conceiving it? Like, is it affected in some way? Like all of these biological things that they weren't able to fully conceptualize back then, but they understood the ramifications of. And so because the men had this inherent issue that they were concerned about, it appears in their mythologies in this way, where they are physically taking control of that thing that women have that they want. And this is our way of like sort of seeing that having happened in the quote-unquote past, right, the mythological past, to then account for why the men are the most, in control in the time in which these things were recorded for us. And it's so explicitly tied to Athena specifically, too, because she is this wise goddess, but also this goddess associated with war, but also craft, the things women did with their time, the things women were expected to do, like Athena is a goddess of, and they are ensuring that even that is still originating in a man in a way that really is meant to emphasize and really solidify that power of the patriarchy in the time. The men are in control, and that's why a goddess like Athena, one who is all about men and war and heroes, why she is linked to Zeus and not a woman. Her mother honestly often gets not forgotten. She is Athena's mother, but she becomes this part of Zeus where she loses all agency, all control over the situation. And it's, of course, sad as a story, but it's also just this visceral reminder of the lived reality and what had come before. And that is goddesses, worship of goddesses over gods, goddesses as the most supremely important because goddesses are the givers of life. And then Zeus just eats that fucking up because he can't handle it, / the men can't handle it. I often, hear from people listening to these early episodes that I just hate dudes. And one, I do not. I hate the patriarchy. If a man is an agent of the patriarchy, then I hate him. If a woman is the agent of the patriarchy, then I hate her. But when it comes to this episode, I really actually quite enjoyed the jokes I was making. Sometimes people say I'm not funny, and I think they're wrong. That whole opening, it's a funny way of describing Zeus, even if now I can go into the nitty-gritty depths of what it means sociologically and anthropologically, but back then it was just funny.
Next up is Leto and the births of Apollo and Artemis. So, Leto was the daughter of 2 titans. She was the goddess of womanly demure and motherhood. Basically, she was the opposite of everything I ever want to be, but that's beside the point.
I'm so curious what sourcing I was using. I think at this point it was just Wikipedia, because this was a thing I thought no one would listen to, and which I wrote on the notes app of my phone while not doing the job that I fucking hated. But it is so interesting to hear me say womanly demure.
Leto's story, when it comes to Zeus, is fairly vague. Basically, the myths say that her hidden beauty, probably something to do with her being demure, catches the eye of ever-lustful Zeus. So Zeus, taking a liking to Leto, like I said, he doesn't think much of marital vows, as we'll learn endlessly, and he impregnates her with twins. What we will also learn endlessly is that Zeus has arguably the most powerful sperm in history. He literally never fails to impregnate a woman. It's troubling, honestly. So Leto is pregnant with twins, and of course Hera finds out. Spoiler, Hera always finds out. And she doesn't take this well. If it is a certainty that Zeus will impregnate a woman, it is an equal certainty that Hera will find out and punish that woman. In her jealousy, she causes all the lands of Earth to shun Leto, making it so that Leto can't find anywhere to give birth to her babies. Why is it that women blame other women? It's like Jerry Springer, but ancient. So Leto is searching everywhere on Earth just for a place to give birth, and finally she finds an island which is not attached to the Earth. It simply floats. Because of that disconnect, it doesn't have the same restraints that Hera put on the rest of the world. This island is Delos, and it's what the ancient Greeks considered the center of the Cycladic Islands. Frankly, I've looked at a map and can't tell you what they were talking about, but I guess they didn't have maps and just gave it a solid guess. The Cycladic Islands, or the Cyclades, are better known as the Greek islands, but Cyclades just has such a better ring to it, so I think we should just bring that back. On this island, Leto is finally able to give birth, which really must have been such a relief. She's just waddling around all gigantic, full of twins, just trying to get them out. First, Leto gives birth to a daughter, Artemis, the older of the twins. Artemis will become the goddess of the hunt. She stays a virgin and is pretty hardcore. And apparently she's quite the prodigy early on, because shortly after she's born, she then acts as midwife for the birth of her twin brother, Apollo. Totally standard, one twin helping give birth to the other one. Apollo, Artemis's twin brother, becomes the god of music, truth and prophecy, healing, the sun and light, plague, poetry, and more. How plague gets in there is beyond me. One of these things just doesn't belong. Apollo, as the god of prophecy, takes the island of Delos as his sacred location. Delos becomes the sanctuary to the cult of Apollo along with Delphi on the mainland, and they both ultimately house the two famous oracles.
Leto's story is, of course, one of the most interesting, but not in the same way as Metis. I'm so obsessed with the Metis story. When it comes to Leto, it's definitely more about explaining, how Apollo and Artemis come to be, but also having this, these links between goddesses of childbirth and motherhood. Leto is coming from Titans of I believe, so Phoebe is her mother, and I believe she's the Titan of, bright intellect. It's where Apollo gets his name Phoebus, and again, it's based in this sort of, brightness, which is how he becomes later associated with the sun, but also, this sort of just general intelligence, and then the childbirth, the sort of labor of it all gets associated with Leto because she has this really terrible labor with her twins, Apollo and Artemis, right? Because of Hera, she's not allowed to give birth anywhere. And so her labor is particularly hard. Her childbirth is particularly hard. And so it becomes this origin for her as a goddess of childbirth, as a goddess of motherhood. She really went through it. I think in this case, her association with Zeus is really more about just sort of linking him to the gods, which she produced, Apollo and Artemis, and less about, obviously it's still tying to the patriarchy like in Metis, but a little bit less about co-opting her role. It's really just about associating her with these other concepts and characters.
Next up is Semele and the birth of Dionysus. Semele was a mortal woman, and as far as I know, she's the only mortal woman to spawn a full-blown god. There are lots of demigods out there, that's super common, but an Olympian god with a mortal mother, that is a rare feat. Semele was the daughter of Cadmus and Harmonia of Thebes, and we will get back to them because they're quite the pair. But for now, it's all about Semele. So Semele and Zeus had an affair, and this is one of those nice, consensual ones, which is so rare, but a great feeling when it comes. But shocker of shockers, Hera finds out. She transforms herself into an old crone, or a nurse, depending what you read, and she befriends Semele, who confides in her. She tells the disguised Hera that, of course, she's pregnant, and the father is Zeus, the king of the gods. Hera, in all her woman-blaming glory, decides to sow the seeds of doubt in Semele's mind. She acts as if she doesn't believe her. The father of your baby is who? I think you're delusional, girl. That's a pretty crazy claim. Which, of course, it is a pretty crazy claim. So Semele starts to doubt herself, just as Hera wanted. Now, Semele doesn't know what's going on, so she confronts Zeus. She tells him he has to show himself to her for real, just to prove that he is, in fact, Zeus, king of the gods. This is not a smart request, though, and Semele, she should have known better. The gods, you see, can't show themselves in their godlike form to humans. You remember, that's how Perseus' mom ended up having sex with gold falling from the ceiling. Zeus, being a semi-decent dude for once, begs her not to ask this of him. He tries to convince her of who he is any other way. What he doesn't tell her, though, is why he can't show himself to her, which frankly I think would have been more convincing than just please don't ask me that. Go from that to if I show you myself, you'll straight up die. Maybe she would have changed her mind, is all I'm saying. But Zeus doesn't do that, because he may be the king of the gods, but he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. Or sharpest needle in the tack, for my favorite murder fans out there. Nope. He appears to Semele in his true form, wreathed in lightning bolts, which probably looked pretty weird. Semele, of course, doesn't get to see this super weird apparition because she straight up bursts into flames. Awesome. Totally cool. Zeus then rescues baby Dionysus, who somehow survives his mom bursting into flames, because obviously Zeus cares more about his male offspring than for the kid's mother, who he could have just said, I can't show you myself or you'll die, and everything would have been fine. So he rescues Dionysus by sewing him into his thigh. That's right. He takes the baby, he cuts open his own thigh, he puts the baby inside, and he sews it right back up again. Which, once more, is one of those reasons I love Greek mythology. Who thought that up? So a few months later, Dionysus is born on Mount Promnos on the island of Icaria when Zeus releases this now fully grown baby from inside his thigh. Again, totally normal. Because of this, Dionysus is said to have two mothers, Semele and Zeus, which seems pretty unfair to me. Zeus gets so much credit for doing, basically nothing. You sewed a baby in your thigh. That's weird more than it is fatherly, or even, let alone motherly.
So I decided to skip the section that I did on the birth of Hermes and the Titan goddess Maya, just because I didn't have that much to say on it, because that story is just awesome, and you should listen to my episodes on the Homeric hymn to Hermes, because it's fucking precious. And so instead we jumped right into the story of Dionysus and his mother Semele, because, surprise, surprise, it's quite similar to the story of Metis, where with Dionysus, Zeus is very intentionally taking control of the role of conceiver. Like Athena, Dionysus is an incredibly important god. He is also an incredibly ancient god. He is old and young and foreign and Greek, and so he really represents a whole lot of things. One, his name comes from, some of the most ancient sources that we have. We know that this god was incredibly important as far back as the Bronze Age, i.e. the oldest we can reasonably say, because that's when writing existed on the Greek mainland. And so Dionysus is so vitally important in terms of their culture, the things he represented, and there is this acknowledgement that he comes from the East, because most likely the god as a concept to be worshipped was brought over from one of the Eastern cultures nearby. That, of course, happened very often in Greece, but Dionysus is almost certainly one of the oldest forms of that happening. But of course, when they are later then developing mythologies or writing them down very specifically, in a way that then will reach us, there's this acknowledgement that Dionysus is from the East, but also this really strong need to ensure that he is Greek, right? He can't, be fully not a Greek god. That would really lessen his importance in the Greek culture. And so while it's acknowledged that he comes from the East, that's why that island of Icaria was mentioned in where he is sort of raised. And that's because Icaria is right on the coast of Turkey, or at least close to it, very far east. And so he has these Eastern origins, but in order to ensure that he remains Greek and all the contributions he has, wine, theater, everything, ensure that remains Greek, he has to have this other origin story. And so unfortunately, I think Semele as a character is kind of just a fill-in. She just they needed to have one, and she kind of fit the bill. It would associate her. It would sort of explain a lot of things that he would have had associations, in the area of Thebes, all of that. And so, but the story itself of this sort of trickery, on the part of Zeus and of Hera, of course, that's just coming in terms of sort of a way to understand these things. But the most important part is the whole sewing Dionysus into his thigh, right? And so once again, the mother cannot live. Zeus has to do the gestating himself, like in the case of Athena. And that is so not only to tie him to Greece and its Olympian gods, but also really specifically to tie him to the patriarchy. And I think that that's most interesting with Athena and Dionysus because it appears in two really distinct ways. Like Athena is sort of inherently created as part of the patriarchy, right? She is an agent of the patriarchy from day one. I still love her, but that remains true. Whereas Dionysus is kind of constantly actually fighting against the patriarchy in his just general mythos, right? He does not fit into a gender binary. He is not a particularly masculine god. He is a very feminine, very gender fluid god. He typically hangs around with women, the maenads. He's all about drunkenness and orgiastic rite, this kind of like loss of self-control, this like just ability to really open yourself up to the world, to the things around you. He is a threat. Like, he is literally a threat to the patriarchy in a divine form. And so to try to wrangle that in and ensure that it, couldn't cause too much harm to the patriarchal order that, was existing around when these myths were being recorded for future consumption, he is then given this really strong association with Zeus, the literal patriarch, the most masculine of gods. Like, it's this way to kind of bring Dionysus into that world, kind of kicking and screaming. And it's fucking fascinating.
Let's continue now with a small collection of other memorable instances of Zeus and his insatiable desire for women and one man, no matter the lengths he must go to. Number 1. Io. Io was a priestess of Hera in the city of Argos. This was a city particularly aligned with Hera. Just as Athena reigned over Athens, Hera reigned over Argos. Io, as a good priestess to the goddess, is frequently hanging out and worshipping in the temple to Hera. Unfortunately, though, as a result of being so close to the queen of the gods, the king of the gods notices and he takes a creepy shine to Io. It is, of course, already very clear, but this is a bad thing. Zeus is kind of a pig. Zeus lusts after Io, and she continually rebuffs his advances. But Zeus can't take no for an answer, and depending on which story you read, eventually he either straight up rapes her or she gives in to him, which frankly isn't much better and probably, was a way to sugarcoat what is otherwise a pretty awful story. In either case, Zeus sleeps with Io, but of course he needs to hide this from his wife because Zeus is a pig for sure, but Hera also has this really shitty habit of punishing the women rather than punishing the rapist. What a surprise, right? I mean, that would never happen today. Anyway, so eventually, in an effort to hide his affair with Io and hide Io herself, Zeus transforms her into a heifer. That's right, he turns her into a cow, because he's an asshole. And apparently the only solution he can come up with is to turn this woman into a cow. But you see, the trick is, he does this so that he can keep Io around, and so he can keep seeing her. Because apparently he was fine with the fact that he would keep seeing and being intimate with a cow. To each their own. I mean, again, the lengths he will go to. Hera, of course, she finds out who the cow really is, because, like I said earlier, spoilers, she always does. But also, why would Zeus just have a cow hanging around? Honestly. And she tricks Zeus into giving her Io. Hera says she wants the heifer as a present, and Zeus obviously has no way of refusing this request without making it obvious why he doesn't want her having this particular cow. So he gives her Io as a gift. But also, is it really a gift, as someone had to ask? Hera, knowing full well who she actually has on her hands, then sends one of her loyal followers, a fellow by the name of Argus Panoptes, to watch over Io and prevent Zeus from getting at her. Argus would act as her guard, following her wherever she went. You see, Argus Panoptes is no ordinary guy. He has 100 eyes. So there'll never be a moment when Io is not trapped under his gaze. But also, it makes him really ugly. He's 90% eyes. Just picture that. Again, Greek mythology. He must look like a real freak, but he's ever helpful to Hera. Zeus, though, he just can't keep away from the women he wants, so he sends Hermes, his little messenger, down to distract Argus, and eventually Hermes slays him. It's not clear if Zeus asked him to do that or if Hermes just got a little carried away. Either way, dude's dead. And Hera is totally distraught. This was her guy. Little side note, eventually, to honor Argus, she places his 100 eyes into the feathers of a peacock, which is why they look like eyes. I just think that's adorable. But our story isn't done yet. With Argus now disposed of and Hera horribly depressed about it, Zeus, good husband that he is, not actually, frees Io. But Hera, totally pissed, sends a gadfly to just follow Io around forever, just continually stinging her, just always. Because at this point, the poor woman is still a cow. Eventually, Io is turned back into a woman, thank God, and of course, Zeus learns no lessons, and he still can't keep his hands off of her, and they end up having a couple of kids. The moral of the story here is, there have always been awful men in this world, and there have always been women who will blame the victim. Honestly, Hera, why didn't you just turn Zeus into a cow and then have him continually stung?
Ugh, Io. Honestly, okay. I really, when it came to deciding what to do this week, I was like, all right, I'm back from this holiday. I was struggling to get my brain to work again. I was having enough trouble before, and then ADHD's just gone absolutely wild. So I was like, okay, I just want to do, another one of these. I really enjoyed revisiting these episodes last times I've done it, and you guys all agreed that you liked it too. So it's thrilling. You know what? The third episode, Zeus, somebody recently tweeted because they just found the show and was listening to that. And I thought, you know what? That one will be perfect. That'll just be fun. I forgot though that in the 7 years that I've now been doing this, the things that I have learned about the background of these stories, so specifically the Zeus stories, because they symbolize so much more than we really can even conceptualize just coming at these stories. I'm perpetually thrilled at the way that my knowledge and my understanding has grown over these 7 years. But when I realize that I can do it this way and kind of really revisit that stuff for you guys, oh my God, I'm just fucking thrilled. Anyway, I'm just losing it over how excited I am because Io is so interesting. And so I know that I'm going to go too long. So this will be the last one we do in today's episode. And then I think next week what I'll do, or on Friday rather, what I will do is finish off some of these and then provide some other kind of fun celebratory anniversary special for you all on Friday. But in the meantime, Io. I know I have too much to say about her. So the great thing about Io, she obviously represents all of the things that I've talked about, earlier in terms of the patriarchy. I won't even get into that because it's just generally the same. Because what she represents outside of that, outside of the problematic nature of the patriarchy is way more interesting and way more, because it's way more tied to actually understanding how Greek mythology informed the understanding of the ancient Greek culture of the time. And so, as a reminder, this story would be coming around in the Archaic Age. That's when it's being really developed based on, kind of whatever evidence they had from before, right? Whatever sort of remained from the Bronze Age that they sort of could conceptualize and then come up with their own kind of mythological history based on, what they're seeing, that hundreds of years later, right? The remnants of the Bronze Age. So just remember that series I did and kind of how they were developing myths based on what they could see, but had no real knowledge or living cultural history of. So they had to create their own. And Io is one of the most important characters when it comes to creating the mythological history of Greece as a culture, because they obviously conceptualized and understood that the Egyptian culture, right, to the south of them, had been going for a lot longer, right? The Egyptians were so much more ancient. They were considerably more advanced than the Greeks during the Bronze Age. We have way more records, all of these things. So the Greeks knew, like, okay, these people to the south who we have lots of dealings with, because again, the Mediterranean is just this big super highway even in the Bronze Age, and they were fully aware of the Egyptians. They knew their contributions. They understood that the Egyptians were these like very, very impressive people that were sort of like just, I mean, honestly, I think that like if Atlantis could be anything, it's just fucking Egypt, where the Greeks were like, oh my God, like you're so much more advanced than us. We're kind of still figuring ourselves out, and you guys have it figured out for the last 1,000 years. And so, you know, the Egyptians looked really impressive. And if Greece, if Greek mythology represents anything, it's like Greece's desire to make themselves feel as important as everyone else around them in the Mediterranean, despite like technically not being. And Io is that, because Io's whole thing is that, you know, Zeus sleeps with her, you know, the whole Hera thing, right? We're just infusing all of this patriarchal nonsense into the story. But the key point is that Io has to wander, right? Io wanders from the Peloponnesian Peninsula, you know, the Argolid specifically. She wanders from there, like very heavily mainland Greece, right? Really deep, very specifically where Mycenae is, right? So Io wanders from the ancient area of the Bronze Age where the later ancient Greeks could only see that there had been an incredibly impressive culture that had come before them, the Mycenaeans. They could see that, and so they conceptualized this story of Io going from this most ancient of places to them, and she goes all the way up the mainland, over like all around the edge of the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, down into Turkey, all over through Asia Minor, you know, and then through the Levant and the Canaanite people of ancient Palestine, through to Egypt, where they knew that there was, you know, this really, really important culture. And so then they have Zeus. You know, okay, well, Zeus made babies with Io, because for all that I was joking this episode about Zeus's like super sperm, like the whole point is it's like Heracles, right? Like he has to create as many offspring with as many people as possible in as many regions as possible, because that is the way that they can link all of the mythology together, this mythological history. Because remember, at the time, like this is tied to their concept of cultural history. It's a way to just link Zeus to all of it. And so Zeus and Io have children while she is in Egypt. Io becomes the mother of these children in Egypt, and then the cultural history gets to link them to the creation of the Egyptian civilization, because one of the children that they give to Io and Zeus when she is in this region is named Aegyptus. Because Egypt would be the Greek name for Egypt. And so they name him that, being like, essentially they're like, oh, a Greek actually founded Egypt, didn't you know? Okay, I went to try to correct myself back there, but honestly, the way I had said it, I think is just too clear. I'm not going to redo it. So just to like go back to what I literally just said, Aegyptus was not her son, he was her grandson. So just like the first child is named Epaphus, and then Aegyptus comes later, and the thing I just explained still stands. It's just there's like a generation in between. But what's most interesting, because I went and double checked myself and noticed that I was wrong, is that not only, you know, does he eventually become, or does Io become the grandmother of Aegyptus, but also this king called Agenor, who they call, you know, the king of the Phoenicians, mythologically. He becomes the father of Cadmus and Phoenicia. And that is, you know, that is the Greeks understanding the ancient Canaanite people of the Levant, of ancient Lebanon and Palestine. And it is their way of understanding those people, because the Canaanite people, the Phoenician people, there's a lot of, I'm a little uncertain about the two names historically versus mythologically, because my brain tends to stick in myth. So I won't pretend that this is all historically, but mythologically, the Phoenicians are in that region. And I believe they are linked up with the Canaanite people who were, historically in that region, who also could be called Philistines, who also could be called Palestinians. And anyway, just turns out that it's like 2,500 years old, the name Palestine, let alone the people. Did you know that actually in the ancient Mediterranean, as I have spent 7 years telling you, it was so interconnected. There was so much trading and movement and migrating of ancient people and interacting and sharing of cultures. There was so much of that it's almost like two different groups of people can be from the same area of the Mediterranean, and then one of those people has absolutely no right to just steal that land and then kill everyone on it while we all watch on our phones. Free Palestine. So Io is in by having these children and then this grandchild Egyptus, she is becoming this Greek link to Egypt in their cultural mythological history. But not only that, is that Egyptus has a brother, and that man is named Danaus, and then Danaus eventually travels with his 50 daughters, the Danaids, and they travel back to the Peloponnesian Peninsula, to the Argolid, where Io came from. So her grandchildren, make this full circle link back to Greece, to mainland Greece. And that's where then the Argolid dynasty gets founded, which eventually will lead to Perseus. And so through this story of Io and her wandering, we get this Greek cultural mythological history that makes ancient Greeks more impressive than the Egyptians, right? It links them to the founding of the Egyptian culture, civilization, because the ancient Greeks of that time recognized the importance, the impressive nature of Egypt and also of the Phoenicians in the Levant. They recognized the incredibly ancient Bronze Age, if not earlier, definitely earlier, what I'm talking about, the ancient nature of both of those people, and they found a way to link it to Greek origins so that they could, keep this impressive nature of these other two groups and link it up with their own, because they would have been, interacting and sharing all of this culture and knowledge and trade and like everything. So they wanted to link it mythologically as well. The story of Io is also a great kind of living memory of the migrations that took place at the end of the Bronze Age, during the collapse of the Bronze Age, everyone moving around, sharing their cultures, everyone kind of shifting places, those almost 4,000 years ago, and how groups in the ancient Mediterranean moved a lot 4,000 years ago. And more than one group can have claim over to land, except that if one of those groups takes it by killing everyone and destroying the earth and burning 1,000-year-old olive trees and, taking the water and killing everyone, I just don't think, that really shows that they have any kind of legitimate claim to land. Because I think if you have a legitimate indigenous claim to land, you probably should want to, not bomb it to the point where the land will be completely useless for nature for the next 100+ years, because it's a distinctly North American colonialist idea that to take land you have to destroy it and completely forget the way that it is meant to be used and completely kill and ruin the lives of the people who have been actively caring for that land for 2,000 to 3,000 years, because the people who have been caring for it for that long know how to care for it. They know how to use it, and that's a threat. Did I intend this episode to come out like this? Nope, but I just keep watching a genocide on my phone like you all, and I give fewer and fewer fucks about how this could affect my career. So here we are. This episode is unhinged. Sometimes it happens. That's where I'm going to end it today. I'm really glad I picked this one. I didn't realize it was going to become quite so. I don't want to say it's political because it turns out it's actually just like humanity and like not wanting to watch innocent people die and 1,000-year-old trees burn. And anyway, that's the end for today. I will return to you all on Friday. This is such a great example of what it's like to have ADHD that's completely unchecked. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I mean, again, this is 7 years, and I just, you know, like, it does mean 7 years. I mean, sometimes I just have to ramble at you because there's just so much that lives in my head, and I honestly did not realize how much I was going to love sharing the kind of cultural mythological history behind all of these stories. I should have realized, but like, oh my god, it accidentally linked up to like everything I'm most interested in right now, which is like finding those little bits of living memory, those little bits of like cultural remnants of a pre-patriarchal society. It's just, it's such a joy to do this, and I'm really so thrilled you guys like this. I'm definitely gonna keep it up. I'm not gonna do too many of these. I don't want to bog you down. I do want to make sure I bring you new stuff all of the time, but these really are a really fascinating way of revisiting some of this stuff and looking at everything beyond the story itself, because the stories are amazing. They're really fun and weird and dark, but the stuff that is behind them, that cultural memory, that cultural history that's coming through in these stories is sometimes so much more interesting. So I'm so thrilled to share it. Just a reminder, please do submit any question you might have to this year's anniversary Q&A, mythsbaby.com/questions. It's linked in the episode's description. I want to hear whatever you guys want to know. I am happy to rant and ramble about anything, to answer anything you guys have got. I mean, not if it's weird. And stay tuned for more on this group trip and everything else, and some really actually really fun stuff coming. I've got new merch plans. I've teamed up with an incredible artist. We have so much coming for you. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer. Utterly incredible. Laura Smith is taking a little hiatus with us, but I don't want to just not mention her name. She's just not working at this moment. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I really do love this shit.